Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another one of our Mindful Monday sessions. So we're very honored this evening to have Reverend Jikai with us. So a brief bio about Reverend Jikai. So Reverend Jikai grew up Catholic, but became a Buddhist at the age of 15 during a year-long exchange in Toyama, Japan. During the week, he would read whatever Buddhist sutras he could get his hands on, and then on weekends, he would ride his bicycle to various temples, attending services and asking many questions. After returning to Australia, he contacted Venerable Jayo Moxon, who was running a small Tendai community in Brisbane, Australia. Though Gyro Sensei and Jikai lived in very different parts of Australia, they managed to meet a few times a year and regularly make contact. Via Gyro Sensei, Jikai was introduced to the late Archbishop Ara Ryokan of the Hawaii Tendai Mission in Honolulu. Shortly thereafter, Jikai became a disciple of Ara Ryokan, who impressed upon him the importance of one's karmic connections to the Buddha-Dharma. He took ordination at the Tendai Hawaii Mission in Honolulu and trained there under Venerable Aya's direction. Finally, in 2015, Jikai was accepted to and attended the seminary program on Mount Hiei in Japan. After the completion of his training, Jikai moved to Tokyo and worked at the Tendai Buddhist High School of Komagomi Gakuen for 5 years. During this time, he assisted a number of temples, participated in seminars on behalf of the Tendai School, and translated various materials into English. At the end of 2020, he returned to Australia and now operates the Tendai Buddhist Sangha of Australia at the Enmitsuji Temple in the Hawkesbury region of New South Wales. There, they offer weekly lessons on Tiantai Tendai teachings and instruction on meditation, chanting, and making offerings. Reverend Jikai also holds a Master of Research from Macquarie University and has made it his lifelong labor of love to translate Buddhist sutras and Tendai texts in the hopes that the seeds of the Buddha-Dharma may be firmly planted in the soils of the West. And that is what Reverend is going to be talking to us tonight with a talk entitled Ink and Insight, the Contemplation of Copying. So just a very brief overview of what this talk's going to be about. The practice of copying sutras has been a common form of cultivation among Buddhist practitioners for millennia, and while the very act of duplicating a sutra benefits others by disseminating the Buddha-Dharma, the practical and meditative boons this practice offers to the copyist are hard to overestimate. Now, on our website, it does have more of a description that goes into some of those boons, but I'm actually going to keep it a bit of a surprise because we're about to learn all that from Reverend this evening. So please, everyone, welcome Reverend Jikai.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I hope that the discussion this evening will be interesting for folks. I would like to say just at the outset, at the very beginning there, that the topic for the discussion, that is the copying of sutras or suttas, depending on the tradition, might strike some of you as a rather mundane activity. The transcription of words and letters or characters, depending on the language in which it's occurring. But against all the odds, I hope to convince you all that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and therefore to convince you of the benefits of these kinds of quote-unquote textual practices. In this case, particularly copying, but not limited to copying necessarily. One short warning, however, the first part of the talk will be purposefully somewhat frustrating. And I'm doing that precisely to, if you like, buck us out of that sense of sutra copying being merely this mundane activity of transcribing a written document. Okay. All right, wonderful. Now we will begin with a short guided meditation, but before we start with that visualization, what I will do is share my screen just before we jump in. Therefore, can I just check with Johnny that everyone can see my screen there?
Yep, that is perfectly fine.
Wonderful. All right, I will. There we go. Okay, that should be better for folks. All right. So for our guided contemplation, which I hope will ground the rest of the discussion for this evening, I'm aware that folks are coming from different backgrounds and have different experience, but To begin with, as is the case in any serious or robust form of traditional meditation, there are always three things in meditative practice which we are, quote unquote, monitoring as we move forward. Those, of course, are the body, the breath, and the mind. And these, for practical purposes, just so that we're aware, because it will come up later in our talk this evening, are representatives, of course, of the three forms of karma that we enact all the time, every day. So that is, of course, the karma of our body, our physical actions, the karma of our mouth, our verbal action, and the karma of our minds, the thought action that is occurring. So beginning with the body then, even though we're all online and therefore sitting at desks and so forth, I'd ask that you, as long as you're not in pain doing so, try to sit up straight and neatly within your chair. If you are wearing something that is a little bit tight, make sure that it is adjusted appropriately for this short sitting. Next, I'd ask you to relax your shoulders. For this short contemplation, I will have you simply put your hands in your lap comfortably and either close your eyes from here on or half close them, meaning that you're closing the eye just enough that the eyes are not looking about, but that there is light coming in, and therefore that your attention is not prone to wander into other thoughts during this brief contemplation. So close your eyes now. Now we'll come to the breath. Again, for this short contemplation, I want us to keep it simple. Purely ensure that this is measured, that it is deep and abdominal, that is from the diaphragm, if you are familiar with that kind of breathing, and simply ensure that it is controlled in the sense of being even on the in and on the out. Now we turn to the mind, the crux of our contemplation. I want you to begin by imagining that you have decided to copy and write out a sutra, sutta, or tantra, as the case may be. This can be a particular sutra, sutta, or tantra for which you are fond, or this can be more broadly taken. Now, I'd like you to visualize that you are washing your hands and rinsing your mouth out. In doing this, remind yourself that cleansing the hands, you're purifying your bodily karma, and rinsing the mouth, you're purifying your verbal karma. Visualize that you are now taking your seat on a Dharma throne, wide, spacious, and beautifully adorned. Surrounding your seat, visualize the fourfold assembly of monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. And if you're able, the 8 kinds of beings, the devas, the nagas, the yakshas, gandharvas, ashuras, garudas, kimnaras, mahoragas. Imagine that they are looking up at you, waiting expectantly. In front of you, on a table, is the sutra book, as well as a blank sheet of paper and a writing implement. As you open the sutra book, remind yourself of the following. This sutra is the boat that crosses over the sea of the 3 existences. It is the provision upon which great buddhi is realized. In age after age, it is difficult to encounter. In birth after birth, it is difficult to hear. I presently have the good fortune to come across it, and so I will now read and copy it with a mind of deep devotion, so that myself and others may together attain unsurpassed buddhi. And as you visualize beginning to write the sutra with your own hand, remind yourself of the following. These letters, as the bearers of Dharma, are each Buddhas, who likewise transmit the Dharma. As I write out, these Buddhas will come to pervade the 10 directions. As they are read by beings near and far, expounding the Dharma in accordance with their capacities. Those Buddhas will one day return to where I am to instruct me once more, and emitting the light of wisdom now and on their return, They illuminate my body and extinguish my beginningless transgressions and misdeeds. The way in which they will transform other sentient beings is also like this. Having contemplated the sutra and your copying in this way, next you must reflect on the following. Specifically, in regards to the copier of the sutra, yourself, and the sutra which you are copying. Regarding the sutra, consider, what is the sutra? Is the sutra the physical scroll or book? Is it the paper and ink with which you copy? Is it the covers or the spine? Regarding yourself as the copier, consider, are the words which are copied produced by the hand, or are they produced by the mind which recognizes them? Is there a self to the body copying them, or is there no self to the body copying? Who is the one who copies? Is it the mind that copies, or is it the hand that copies? Next, reflect in the following way. Even though that which we call a sutra is not to be found in the letters which are copied, there definitely exists before me sutra scrolls, paper, ink, sentences, and words. Even though there is no self to be found in the one copying it out, with my letters I definitely expound and transmit the Dharma for the sake of the four assemblies. Even though both the sutra and the copier are neither found within their objects nor outside them, they cannot be said to be separate from their objects, nor from what is outside of them. Even though the sutra is not the sutra scrolls, it is not separate from the sutra scrolls. And even though it is neither copied by the hand or the mind, it is not separate from the hand which writes or the mind which recognizes them. Finally, visualize closing the sutra book. Put down your pen, and with one hand on the sutra and the other on the copy you have made, reflect lastly in this way. This unsurpassed, deeply profound, and exceptionally sublime Dharma is difficult to encounter in hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kalpas. I now see, hear, and attain the black and white of its letters and pages, and due to the arrangement of the colored grains and the patterns made by the liquid of this ink, it is such that truth and untruth are both made manifest. You may now release your mind's concentration from the visualization. Return your breathing to its natural flow and open your eyes. Wonderful, wonderful. Now, some of the things that were included in that visualization will be unpacked as we move forward. Let's begin. Given that our talk this evening focuses primarily on the copying of written texts, it might seem a little bit strange that following that reflection, I've got a reminder that Buddha-Dharma is at its core, like all Dharmic cultures, an oral culture. But I'm doing this because it highlights what is going on beneath the surface of the method. Okay, so by not limiting the discussion to merely the written text, I'm showing in a little bit of a sneaky way the relationship between the method of conveying Dharma and the Dharma which is conveyed, that object that is conveyed by the method. So, just making sure that we're all on the same page, many centuries before the first stylus was ever put to a patra leaf to write sutras, suttas, and tantras down, the words of the Buddhas and their disciples were heard. And something funny occurs when Dharma is heard. When the most important thing that you'll ever hear is spoken to you, your only reference for rehearing it is your own memory. That is to say, that when you receive the quote-unquote dharmic speech, the Buddha Vachana, the speech of the Buddha, and if it's important to you, you ensure straight away that it imprints on your mind. It therefore has already changed its mode. It's no longer a spoken word, it's your memory of a spoken word. So, spoken word, mental recollection. But something weirder is happening in that simple interaction of hearing the Dharma and letting the Dharma imprint or soak into your memory, your mind. Those words are no longer just the speech of whoever you heard them from. They're also now readable as your words. You might continue to hear the speaker's voice in your own mind, perhaps, but that is your mind that's producing that speech, not their speech directly. And as soon as you try and pass that speech onto someone else, as soon as you try and transmit that Buddha Vachana, that speech of the Buddha, you consequently then hear them in your own voice literally, not the voice of the person that you heard them from per se. This might sound like a bit of a play with language here, but what I'm hinting at is that spoken word, written word, mental recollection, your voice, someone else's voice, these physical containers or carriers of Dharma and the Dharma which is being conveyed have a strange relationship from the very beginning. These mediums should not just be thought of as the physical carriers of Dharma. When you look at a sutra book, it is not just words that happen to carry Dharma. They are just words, but they are also imbued with what we might call an esoteric quality. That is this Dharma-ness, that thing which it carries. Dharma, or truth with a capital T, if you like. In other words, the medium in which Dharma is made tangible is simultaneously distinct from the Dharma which it carries and identical to the Dharma which it carries. I'm sure this sense was at least somewhat clear in the visualization of the written words that we did during that guided contemplation a moment ago. This Dharma-ness is the important stuff, but given that it's always embodied, right? Dharma always has to be Dharma in some form, spoken word, recollected, realized, etc., etc. Because of that very nature, it is always simultaneously distinct from the method conveying and identical in a very fundamental way. We're going to unpack this, so don't worry if this sounds a little bit confusing at this stage. I want to give us just one last demonstration of this stickiness of method versus the Dharma that the method transmits. Consider this somewhat silly example. I don't know if everyone listening tonight is listening from Australia locally or from elsewhere, but just for the moment, let's imagine that you're listening to this talk in a non-Buddhist environment. You don't live in an area where there is a temple on the corner necessarily. In that kind of environment, your first contact with a sutra, sutta, tantra, etc., will likely be via the written book rather than the spoken discoursing of it. The chances that you have a teacher who is going to teach you all of the sutras that you come in contact with directly, verbatim, word of mouth, is highly unlikely in the context of most of us. Now, given that your first point of contact is the written book, it's worth remembering for a moment that every one of those experiences, when you've picked up a sutra, a sutta, or a tantra, each and every occasion has always begun with those famous words in the Sanskrit, evam maya shrutam, ekasmin samaye, or in the Pali, if that's more familiar, evam me suttam, ekam samayam. Yeah. Thus have I heard at one time or on one occasion, at a particular occasion, the Buddha was at, etc., etc. Now, of course, in the historical sense, when you're reading the sutra, you know that the I that heard that statement was the great Ananda. And the one time was whenever the Buddha gave that particular discourse. You likely read rather than heard, but in any case, you can understand where this transmission process is coming from. You understand the I in question and so forth. But putting that historical and obvious context to one side for a moment, what I'd like you to notice is that as you read whatever sutra it is that you were reading, you likely heard what you read in your own voice. And the I hearing was therefore you. And the one time, ekasmin samaye, was not when the Buddha gave the discourse per se, it was right now as you were reading and hearing that discourse. Now, it's at this point that you've probably had enough of my antics and my slippery use of these terms here. You might be wondering why I'm continuing to play with all of these terms in this rather free and perhaps confusing manner. The reason I'm being so infuriatingly fluid with these terms is that I'm trying to simultaneously point out, as I said, that these different modes in which we receive Dharma have a relationship to the Dharma which they convey, which is simultaneously distinct and identical. They cannot be neatly separated out. I want you also to debase those methods by showing you things like, thus have I heard was actually reading in your own voice, etc., 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 and all of these debasing of those methods as well. And finally, I want to use language in this beginning section in this slippery way because I want you to start seeing how one thing bleeds into another and how a single thing can encompass many other things. How a small portion of quote unquote the Dharma can encompass the entirety of the Dharma, for example. And to get you to the point where you're asking the right kinds of questions. That's what I'm trying to do here, as infuriating as that may have been thus far. Now let's get into the meat of copying and the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. Okay, so we need to start asking really interesting questions about the nature of the Dharma, what constitutes a sutra, what is a Buddha as the expounder or speaker of Dharma, how do the answers to these questions relate to me when I speak or copy out the sutras, and then of course in the final analysis, what is the relationship between the sutra, myself, the copier, and the Buddha who expounded them? We can't really get to terms with why the Buddhas speak of practices like copying out, writing out sutras in such laudatory terms. We can't get to the nuts and bolts, the essence of why it is spoken of in such beautiful and flowery superlative ways without asking these types of questions, because it pushes this discussion beyond the obvious mundane sense of writing words from a page that you are looking at onto another page with a writing implement, etc., etc. Now, that might sound obvious, but it's necessary for us to remove all of those suppositions at the beginning, to look at some of these passages like the ones we have on the slide, and get into what Copying Sūtras is all about.
Sorry, Reverend. Just
Yes.
having issues with the slides appearing. They haven't changed at all, at least from my end.
Okay, is that the same for everyone else? Does anyone? So they
It
just
seems as though it's in present. If it's through PowerPoint, it's in presenter view, perhaps.
okay.
So yeah, so we're seeing like a preview of two of the slides.
Bear with me. I do apologize. Bear with me
No,
one
no,
moment.
it's good. Are you using two screens by any chance, Reverend?
I am. I am.
Yeah, so I think it's if you share it normally, you then
Hmm.
need to select something at the top which switches which screen shows what.
I will try and reshare. Bear with me. Is
Yeah, perfect.
that better?
Yeah.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Reverend.
No worries. Thank you for bearing with me. I do apologize. Fingers crossed. Let me know if it goes out of whack again. So, because we're talking about debasing some of our suppositions and the mundane way of thinking about copying sutras or even speaking about sutras, I'm going to pick, or I have picked, a number of passages from a particularly famous Mahayana Sutra, in this case, what we call in English the Lotus Sutra or the Sadharma Pundarika Sutra, to illustrate a little bit some of these under the surface, more profound relationships between the moving parts. So, looking at the first quote here, it reads, "If one speaks this sutra, then they see me." Okay, the me speaking here is Shakyamuni Buddha. They also see the Tathagata Prabhutaratna. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the term Tathagata, that just means, depending on how you read the Sanskrit, thus gone or thus come. So one who understands thusness, one who has come to grips with, either realized and then come back, or gone to, as in understood thusness. And Prabhutaratna many treasures is the name of that Tathagata. And all the manifestation Buddhas, so many Buddhas, Nirmanakaya Buddhas is what's been translated here. Now, I'm translating very literally here. The word I've translated as speaks is usually written in sutra translations with the more fluid expounds. But I'm using the word speaks here just to illustrate this relationship between the sound, the spoken word, and the text, and the Buddha. So here, just taking this one passage, the very act of literally embodying the sutra, right? When you actually speak the sutra, when you become the vessel, the Dharma vessel, that act itself is the act of not just seeing the Shakyamuni Buddha, but other Buddhas, all Buddhas. Yeah, what it means to be a Buddha, seeing Buddha as Buddha, if you like. That very act is the act of seeing. If one speaks this sutra, then they see me. Right? Is the plain reading here. In the second quote, we see the same relationship between the act and the seeing, but we're also told what will happen when the speaker does not remember that which is heard, right? We're given, if you like, some of those nuts and bolts, those more conventional, mundane realities of trying to speak a sutra, memorize a sutra, copy a sutra accurately. Yeah, you think of copying them. The equivalent of forgetting in speech or from memory would be the equivalent of missing words or letters, etc., right? So our second quote says, "From time to time, I, the Buddha, will cause the speaker of the Dharma to see me. And should they forget or miss passages or phrases of this sutra, I will return and speak it to them, that they may be caused to have perfect possession of it." Now, just for now, take these two quotes together. It's perhaps wise to go back to one of those questions I hinted at before. What is a Buddha? Is a Buddha just a person who lives in a certain place and time and gives X discourse to X assembly? Or, as the title Buddha suggests, is a Buddha literally someone whose very being is Bodhi, right? That is the Dharma itself, right? In the Mahayana, we sometimes distinguish the Buddha into Rupakaya, that is the physical body, and the Dharmakaya, the Dharma itself, yeah, as constituting the Buddha. Now, in both of these quotes, we've got the act of engaging with the physical Dharma, i.e. the sutra, and the sense that the relationship between the act of engaging with the Dharma and the Buddha is one of identity. Engaging with the Dharma is engagement with the Buddha himself. Sticking with that second quote and pressing it just a little bit, we're given not only the idea that engagement with the Dharma is engagement with the Buddha, like we saw in both quotes, but also that when you speak the Dharma, I speak the Dharma back to you. When you speak the Dharma, the Buddha speaks it back to you. The Buddha and you are in dialogue when you read, recite, memorize, copy, expound, explain, exegete the sutra. Okay, there is a dialogue that is going on there. And there's a very famous passage in this sutra that is actually the background for the discussion that's happening here. That quote is from the second chapter of that sutra, where it says, "Only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fully fathom the true characteristic of all dharmas." Now, it could just say only Buddhas understand the Dharma, right? It could say that, but it doesn't. It says only a Buddha together with a Buddha. This relational dialogue that is always in play is the background that is lurking behind the discussion here. Okay. Now, in the third quote, we have another tantalizing layer of depth that's added. In this passage, we are put into the driver's seat, as it were. The usual context in sutras is we have the Buddha expounding the Dharma, and he might say after that something to the effect of, if all of you sentient beings are able to believe and understand what I have said, then you will receive such and such a benefit, such and such a realization. That's the usual formula. But here we are to assume that we are speaking the Dharma, and the Buddha consequently says to us in response to our expounding, embodying the Dharma, if there are individuals who are able to believe that which you have said, then they will see me and also see you and the Bhikshu Sangha, as well as all of the Bodhisattvas. Now, the important part in this quote is, why are we involved here? Okay, I've got this sense that engaging with the Dharma is seeing the Buddha. If the Buddha stopped at, if there are individuals who believe that which you've said, which is Dharma, then they will see me. We haven't added anything to the quotes that we've just read. It's worth us pausing for a moment and asking what this is saying to us about ourselves in this act. So we saw that the act of embodying the Dharma, of reading, reciting, copying, expounding, explaining, that very act is identical to seeing the Buddha. Not part of the Buddha, not the Dharma which he teaches, but identity. There is an identity between that act and seeing the Buddha now. You know? Here, the relationship is extended to us. The relationship is extended to us, the copier, the reader, the reciter. Before we go too far off into the deep end, and we can flesh this out a little bit more as we move forward, and of course, if there are any lingering questions as well, please don't hesitate to ask as we move forward. But let's look at the next passage, because it might give us a little bit more context once again for this strange kind of relationship between ourselves enacting Dharma by copying, reading, reciting, etc., the Buddha who expounds the Dharma, the progenitor of the Dharma, and the Dharma itself. So in the next passage we have Everywhere it, i.e. the Dharma, is spoken, read, recited, copied, and in the places where the scrolls of the sutra are kept, in all of them should be erected a stupa of the precious seven, made to be extremely high, wide, and ornately adorned. But there is no need to place in it sharira. Sharira means relics. So usually a stupa contains the relics of a deceased Buddha or of a realized arhat or bodhisattva, etc. But we're told here, wherever the sutra, wherever the Dharma is expounded, copied, etc., erect a stupa, usually meant for the Buddha, but there is no need to place part of the Buddha in this stupa at all. Why is this? Because the entire body of the Tathagata, of the Buddha, is already present therein. Wherever the Dharma is being spoken, copied, etc., therein is the entirety of the Buddha present, not a portion, not a reflection, not a hazy view through a glass dimly, right? The entire body of the Tathagata is present. And this is why this passage is admonishing us to treat the places in which such actions take place in the same way as we would treat those places in which the Buddha reads, recites, expounds, etc., etc. So the entire dialogue sets up an identity between the Buddha, the Dharma, us when we embody, copy, read, recite the Dharma. Okay, there is an identity between those things, but this quote has added something else. Notice the passage says, in this context, the scrolls of the sutra. A sutra is only a part of the Buddha's Dharma. And yet, if the whole of the Buddha is present, where a part of the Dharma is present, then the whole of the Dharma must also be present in a part of the Dharma. Once again, there is a rather, let's say, non-intuitive relationship. Remember that the sutras, for us good Buddhists, is supposed to be a description of how the Buddhas see things in their own understanding. So as strange as this kind of identity/relationship is, it behooves us to chew on the way in which the Buddha is seeing the relationship between these things. It's not nothing. It's not a mistake. It's not poorly chosen words. It matters, and it's worth us considering at length before we start copying, reading, reciting, expounding, speaking the Dharma. So, the last quote on this page says, should there be individuals who copy and write out even a verse of the sublime Dharma Flower Sutra, respectfully looking upon the scrolls of this sutra as the Buddha, making various offerings to it, all of those individuals will certainly become Buddhas in the future. There are a lot of non-negotiable moving parts here. This isn't vague. So what do we have? We have the act of copying out the sutra, for example. We have the added criterion, that is, that we have noticed the pattern in the above passages. In other words, we see the text that we're copying as exactly the same as the Buddha himself. The sutra is the Dharma is the Buddha. When we copy out the sutra, we copy it out as if we are looking at the Buddha himself, as if we are regarding the Buddha himself. We make offerings to it, we treat it in this way. That's that added criteria in this last quote. The result of this, the result of doing this engagement and being cognizant of the fact that engaging with the Dharma is engaging with the Buddha, that the Dharma and the Buddha are identical, that the part of the Dharma, the sutra, is the whole of the Dharma. If we are doing these things, we're told the result is nothing short of the absolute assurance of our own Buddhahood. Now, before we say anything else, so much for the mundane writing out of a text from one book into another, right? Whatever this act is, it's deeply profound, and the Buddha wants to impress upon us how strange this act is when understood appropriately, when understood in the way a Buddha understands these actions. Now, even if this sounds a little bit esoteric and difficult for us to really tangibly chew upon, it should at the very least sound great, right? It should sound fantastic, excellent. Do you mean that when I engage with a sutra, I'm engaging with the Buddha directly? Fantastic. Do you mean that when I read or copy out even a verse of the sutra, my Buddhahood is assured? Fantastic. Wonderful, right? That's the quick response to these bewildering relationships and identities between these moving parts. Yeah? In these moving parts, we have an incredibly profound meditation. The nature of the Buddha, the nature of the Dharma, the relationship between the Dharma in the abstract as a non-embodied thing and the physical manifestation of it in the world as sutras, as speech, etc., etc. And finally, the relationship between ourselves, the Dharma which we engage with, and the Buddha. And of course, that last quote there gives us the consequences of understanding this simultaneous distinction and therefore relationship between these moving parts and identity between the moving parts. Okay. The last thing I'll say, if the Buddha is identical to the Dharma, if by engaging with one, I engage with the other, if the whole of the Buddha is present, remember, the whole of the Buddha is here. Forget about putting a sharira, a relic of part of him. The whole of it is here in the single act of speaking or copying the sutra. And if our recognition of these things guarantees our Buddhahood, then the entire path to Buddhahood should also be present in each of these acts. The entire path of Buddhahood should be present in copying the sutra, in speaking it, in engaging with the Dharma. Well, wouldn't you know, the Lotus Sutra has got us covered. It wants to make sure that we're tracking the profounder implications carefully, and it wants to give us confirmation of our insight that this must be the case. The entire path must be here. If just engaging with this is to engage with the whole, if just engaging with this is the entire assurance of my complete Buddhahood, etc., etc., etc. The Lotus Sutra here says the Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, that is the unsurpassed, perfect and complete bodhi, awakening, of all bodhisattvas, every bodhisattva that has ever attained Buddhahood is derived in its entirety from this sutra. Now, for our purposes, don't stress about the this here. The this is here purely because this sutra is not every sutra in context. Okay? The entirety of a bodhisattva's unsurpassed, perfect and complete awakening is derived from this single component. The part, this sutra, contains the whole, all sutras. Yeah? The part contains the whole. Okay? This, again, is not intuitive to us. We might say, well, that's all good and well, but could it really contain the entirety? I mean, we're talking here, Jikai, your talk is about copying sutras, for goodness sake. Right? Could it really contain the entire path for every bodhisattva if used and understood correctly in this single practice of merely, I use the word merely there, merely copying out a sutra, the sutra. Okay? Now, we might be open to this possibility because we've already swallowed a number of hard identities and relationships, right? The identity between the Buddha and the Dharma, between part of the Dharma and the whole of the Dharma, between us, the Dharma and the Buddha, etc., etc. So now we need to check, is it true? Is it possible to see within this mere act of copying a sutra the entirety of one's Buddhist practice, the Buddha Marga, the path of the Buddhas? Is it possible? Can we see this? Is this just beautiful poetic language? Or can we see it as Buddhas might see it? Okay. Now, I've got on this slide here two very common frameworks for the entirety of the Buddha-Dharma. On the left, we've got the three trainings. That is śīla, the discipline, the pratimoksha, the prohibitions, the precepts, etc. Disciplining oneself, not doing unwholesome activity, etc. Samādhi, that is the development of meditative concentration, that development of that meditative muscle, if you like. And prajñā, that is wisdom. The resultant insight that comes, realizing capacity. All schools accept these three trainings and use these frameworks, so it's as good as any as a marker to check this practice against. But on the right, just in case, depending on people's backgrounds, I've got the 6 perfections or the 6 paramitas, which of course are incredibly common in the Mahayana. The path of the Bodhisattva is the path of perfecting these 6 qualities. Dana, or giving. Śīla, that is the discipline again. Shanti, a bit of a tricky word, usually translated in English as forbearance, but it also means receptivity. If anyone has any questions about that, I'll explain how those 2 words are entailed in this Sanskrit. Virya.
Sorry, Reverend, it just doesn't, it hasn't gone to the next slide.
Once again.
Yeah.
What are we seeing now?
Yeah, like I know for myself, that's perfectly fine to read as is. If no one else has any problems with that, then that should be fine just to have it like that.
Okay, all right. I do apologize, folks. I'm not sure
problem
how to fix this issue. But as I said, so we've got the 3 trainings on the right, on the left, and the 6 perfections on the right. Virya, vigor was the 4th there. Dhyana, that is this meditative concentration, and prajñā, or wisdom. Now, for obvious reasons, you can see that there is a great deal of overlap, and those 2 frameworks do splice across each other. But I want to give us more than one framework to make sure that whatever our background is, we can start to understand how copying of sutras can be utilized in this way, in the way Buddhas intend for us to use this practice of copying sutras, of reading, reciting, expounding, etc., etc. Okay? So our job now is to see how this act, just the act, can contain the whole path, these frameworks. All right? Has that shifted over to the first training for everyone? Yes? Okay, good, good. Thanks, folks. All right. Now, looking at the first of the 3 trainings, the Japanese monk Saicho says the following. In regards to this practice of just copying sutras, I want us to see the patterning. Taking up the scrolls of the sutras with your hands and looking upon the characters of the sutra with your eyes, In doing this, the 3 bodily karmic acts of killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct are not committed with one's body. So this is very obviously the discipline of one's body, just by sitting and copying physically. He must not speak over the sutra. Remember, the sutra is identical to the Buddha. Why shouldn't we? He should close his mouth and maintain his breathing. Why is this so? From the mouth, spittle could spray over the sutra, and as one's attention goes after their words, characters will be mistaken and lines will be omitted in the copying, which is also of great harm. For these reasons, guard one's mouth and be cautious with one's speech while copying. In doing so, the 4 verbal faults are ended, namely false speech, harsh speech, divisive speech, and idle speech. Yeah? So this is discipline of the mouth. Remember, we started the 3 karmas that we purified in our contemplation. You washed your hands and purified the karma of your body. You rinsed your mouth to purify the karma of your mouth. Then you did the contemplation, which purified your mental karma. And the final part here, the discipline of the mind. He does not think over the physical objects given, nor does he hope for various material rewards from the copying. This then is separation from greed. He does not discriminate between self and other. Remember in our contemplation, does the person copying have a self? Is there an other who I give the copy to? Yeah. He does not discriminate in this way, and therefore does not give rise to thoughts of malice. This is my sutra, not yours. Yeah. This then is separation from anger. And he does not discriminate between all of the myriad dharmas. Now, this one's a bit more tricky here. Why does he not discriminate between all the dharmas? Remember that the act and the process that we've been going through, if we've been paying attention, is that the sutra, the dharma, is identical to the Buddha, and we are identical to Buddha and Dharma when we enact. That's why the whole of our Buddhahood is there. Yeah. So he is not distinguishing, this is me copying, that's just a sutra, that is the Buddha who expounded the sutra, etc., etc. He's not discriminating in this way, and this then is separation from the discriminations of ignorance. Greed, anger, and ignorance, the so-called 3 poisons, are the mental wayward karmic drives. So in just the physical act, we have the discipline of body, speech, and mind, according to Saicho here, just by copying the sutra. Yeah. Moving on, what about the perfections? Perfections 1, 2, 3, and 4. Making sure that it's not just this crazy Japanese monk Saicho who's seeing these kinds of patterns, the whole of the path. We have the Chinese monk Zhi. He says, even though there is no giver of the sutra, there is the giving of Dharma. Even though there is no receiver, the 4 assemblies are clearly present. Even though there is no Dharma seat, right? I had you visualize that you were sitting on a Dharma seat, but I'm sure you're sitting at your desk now or on the floor in your home. Even though there is no Dharma seat, one ascends the seat to proclaim the Dharma. There is neither the first, second, nor third, and yet there is a first, second, and third. This is referred to as the paramita of dana, the perfection of giving. The perfection of dana is when one understands that in a provisional sense, one is acting and giving of the Dharma, right? Giving Dharma is what one is doing when they copy out the sutra. They give the Dharma. It is meritorious because others may receive it, right? But the very act of you sitting in your room now and writing out the sutra is you sitting alone in a very tangible sense. Those 2 things are simultaneously true at the same time. Just like the sutra is not all of the Dharma, and yet it is all of the Dharma at the same time. The Dharma is not the Buddha per se, the person of the Buddha, but it is the Buddha. It is what it means to be a Buddha, is to have Dharma. The perfection of giving is when one applies this kind of both simultaneous and identical and not in one's giving of Dharma. That is what it means to perfect giving. What about perfecting śīla, the second of the paramitas? Focusing the mind on the maintenance of the recitation or copying, that it may be without many the many hindrances, is referred to as maintaining śīla. The mere act of you saying to yourself, I will sit and copy this sutra. I will not allow my thought to go elsewhere. I will not do other actions like we saw before. That is the maintaining of discipline. That is śīla paramita. Bearing with unwholesome perceptions, rather, so that renowned fame, wealth, and benefit are unable to vex you, is referred to as kshanti. It's referred to as kshanti. Okay? Kshanti. So kshanti here we said was forbearance. Anyone who engages in any kind of meditative practice, I'm sure, has gone through the experience of the intrusive thoughts. This is not a useful use of my time. I'm better served doing X, Y, and Z. I have to go and do the washing, wash the dog, etc., etc. Yeah? Or maybe the repetitive task of meditating and staying there is in itself irksome. The ability to sit with all of the contending thoughts, bearing with, is the perfection of kshanti. If you sit and use the copying of sutras as a meditative act, and you remain seated, this is a text, it's just, I'm copying a book, it's just words, letters, it's meaningless, it's frivolous discourse, it's provisional, it's a waste of my time, etc., etc. A better use of my time would be meditating on X, Y, and Z, for example. That would give me some gain. Yeah. Renown, fame, wealth, benefit, etc. But the perfection of kshanti, the paramita of kshanti, is the capacity to sit with those things and maintain one's copying in this context. Yeah. And finally, their single-minded concentration without respite and being without indolence from beginning to end is referred to as virya, that is vigor, the perfection of vigor. Just as a funny example here, is anyone, if any of you have read or attempted to read a famous Mahayana sutra called the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's 80 fascicles long. It's a very, very, very long fascicle. In English, in the two current translations, we're talking about something like 3,000–4,000 pages of fairly small text without annotation. These are enormous sutras. If you make a vow to copy that text out, and you remain until that vow is complete, you treat this sutra as if it were the Buddha, you give him your attention from start to finish, I think you can genuinely lay claim to having perfected vigor along the way. Yeah. Right? Now we come back to the Japanese monk Saicho. Remember, our other framework is the trainings. The first training was discipline. The second training is meditative concentration. He says, when writing out and copying the Mahayana, he should be mindful only of the act of writing out and copying and should not think of other actions. This then is the means for the samādhi, the meditative equipoise of the one mind, wherein the one practice subsumes all practices. So the very act of keeping one's concentration on the act of copying, not moving to other actions, is meditative equipoise, is it not? It is the ability to sit with an object, remain with that object unperturbed. Yeah. Once again, what appears to be a mundane act of writing, yeah, when seen the way a Buddha sees it, is much more than the mere act of transcribing. Coming back to the Chinese monk Jikai, and now we're on the fifth perfection of the 6 perfections. We have Jikai saying, focusing one's thought on this sutra and having no craving for pleasant sensations is referred to as dhyana, the perfection of dhyana. of the dhyanas. Yeah. So this is very similar. This tracks with what Saicho said about a different framework, right? The three trainings, but it tracks precisely with his definition there of samadhi, and here dhyana. Going back to Saicho and the final third training here, we have Saicho saying, when writing out and copying the Mahayana, he should constantly and ceaselessly employ non-attachment, absence of false thought, and the wisdom that is without discrimination. Furthermore, he should awaken to the fact that birth and death, or samsara, is identical to nirvana, and comprehend that the klesha are identical to bodhi. This then is the Vajra-like and immovable wisdom. Now, there is a whole lot there, and if people would like me to unpack that, please don't hesitate to ask me to. But sticking with what we've been discussing about copying, remember the dialogue about seeing one who speaks, expounds the sutra, copies the sutra, sees the Buddha. The sutra is identical to the Buddha. This physical, limited object is identical to that which is unlimited, unphysical, dharma par excellence. Yeah? When one understands the act of copying, when one sees the identity between the sutra that is being copied, the Buddha, who is the progenitor of the sutra, and you, the copier, one is employing the wisdom of non-discrimination, that is without discrimination. You see that samsara, the limited, the mundane act of copying, etc., is identical to nirvana. Yeah, the klesha, all of those intrusive thoughts and going through the motions of sitting and remaining and copying and being careful not to miss out on the characters, etc., are identical to bodhi, are identical to perfecting the 6 paramitas, are identical to perfecting or accomplishing the 3 trainings, etc. And back to Zhiyi for that final perfection, which is the perfection of wisdom. Yeah, very similar to the 3rd training there. We have Zhiyi saying, discerning flawlessly and thoroughly understanding the sutra's introductory, main, and transmission sections without exception, as well as its passages and sections clearly, is referred to as prajñā. Yeah, so his reading again is not too distinctly different from Saicho's here, but he keeps it to the act itself. The very act of sitting with the sutra as you copy out the sutra is an act of thoroughly going through the beginning, the middle, the end, without exception, each passage, each section clearly. That is wisdom. If the sutra is Dharma, is Buddha, then doing that carefully and clearly is prajñā, is wisdom. Now, we've covered this sense in which there is this funny both and neither relationship, this identity between the moving parts, between the mundane and the ultimate, between the act of copying and the whole of the Dharma, between the sutra as an embodiment of the Dharma and the Buddha, between us when we copy the Dharma. Yeah, we embody the Dharma, so we are identical with the sutra, the Dharma. The sutra was always identical with the Buddha. There is an identity between the 3, etc., etc. We've gone through the way in which there is an understanding, a framework in which the mundane activity of copying out a sutra is the entirety of the Buddha Marga, the path to Buddhahood. Yeah, we've seen that in the broadest sense. We've seen that the way in which we should view copying, reading, reciting, expounding the sutra is in this non-intuitive, non-discriminating identity relationship that a Buddha sees. Now we're in the position to talk about how one actually sits and copies a sutra. So in my tradition, there are basic components like the ones here, which one can use to make their act of copying into a dharmic practice. You make the mundane act into a dharmic practice. You'll remember that at the beginning in our contemplation, we did what is covered by that first section, preparation. We visualized washing our hands, rinsing our mouth, purifying our body, preparing the items, getting things ready, making sure, and remember, the sutra is identical to the Buddha. Would you not, if you were going to sit down for a day with the Buddha, make sure that you're nicely dressed, carefully presented, you've brushed your teeth, you've washed your hands, yeah? You've set out the tea and coffee for the Buddha to partake with you. There is a preparation that happens to all dharmic activity. Then, once you've done the preparation, you begin the basics of the practice. In other words, you order your deportment. You sit either in our tradition in what is called seiza. If you're familiar with the Japanese traditions, your legs are underneath your body, very famous for causing the legs to go numb for those who are not familiar with seiza. Or, of course, also acceptable and more traditional in the Indic sense, yeah, the lotus posture or half lotus, yeah. In other words, or I've got here, or in a chair. What is the point here? It's not about the way in which you're sitting, it's about the deportment that you are utilizing. If I'm sitting with the Buddha, I'm not going to slouch to one side. I'm not going to lean on my arm. I'm going to sit up respectfully. I'm going to sit squarely in my chair as best as I can in a fashion that is neat, tidy, and will allow me to sit and speak to the Buddha for as long as he wishes to speak with me. Yeah? This is what is being covered here. Then we have what is called the reverence component. You develop or you prepare the ink if you're using the traditional method here. You pour water into the inkstone. You begin to grind the ink. Yeah, you begin to revere the sutra that you're copying. You carefully prepare what you will do to it, as you would with the Buddha. You don't do this haphazardly. This is part of the practice. All of this is the 6 paramitas and the 3 trainings, right? The latter part of this reverential component is usually that we recite the sutra. Another thing that we do is we perform those contemplations that we did at the beginning. We contemplate the sutra. We contemplate the words that we copy out. On the one hand being simply ink, paper, brush, letters, graphite, etc., etc. And also more than that. Not those things, etc., etc. Why? Because this is the way the Buddha told us to view him and the sutra and the Dharma and the mundane act of copying. Yeah, we take what he said seriously. This is our reverence. That's why the section is called reverence or reverential treatment. Then comes the actual copying of the sutra. Carefully write out the title, write out the text that you are copying, write the date that you began copying and the date when you completed it. Write your name. You are the copier. You are part of the Dharma here. Have you done so carefully, earnestly, with meditative equipoise, without missing words? Put your name to it. Yeah. And finally, then, we dedicate the merit gained from this activity. We put our palms together, we bow to the sutra that we copied and the copy we have now made. We've now duplicated the Dharma itself and we dedicate the merit. We dedicate the merit to the awakening of ourselves and to other sentient beings. Yeah. So this is the nuts and bolts, the mundane, how one might go about doing the act once one has ordered the way they're viewing the act, right? But just because we're being respectful, just because we are treating the sutra in the same way that we would treat the Buddhas themselves, That doesn't mean that you cannot make that practice your own. That scaffolding I just provided is the traditional manner in East Asia. But these examples that I have here are examples of people in those places, specifically in Japan, making it their own. On the left, you have there what is essentially an attempt to make a sutra into an anime. Yeah, of course, you don't do it willy-nilly, you don't do it disrespectfully, but in what way can I square the respect I would give to the Buddha in such a way that it is skillful and reaches a particular audience? Then in the middle, you might notice that we have in the top left of those four images, we have Shakyamuni flanked by Ananda and Shariputra. Yeah, Ananda and Shariputra. Then on the right at the top, we have riding on his elephant, the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra. On the bottom left, we have riding on his lion, the Bodhisattva Manjushri. And in the bottom right, we have Achala, the Vidyaraja Achala. In Japanese, is Fudo Myo-o, if you're familiar with that tradition. But you'll notice that we have the images of these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Vidyarajas. Remember that part of copying the sutra was understanding that the sutra was identical to the Dharma, and the Dharma was identical to the Buddha. Copying the sutra is copying the Buddha. Trace an image of the Buddha. Trace an image of what is seen in the sutra. Now, the one in the middle is one adapted for children to be traced. And then on the far right, we have a more traditional depiction of the Bodhisattva Samantabhadra. Yeah, very popular in the sutra we've been discussing. Okay. Be respectful. Treat this practice as you would an interview with the Buddha himself, but that does not mean that you have to stick to the scaffolding I just showed you necessarily. Make it your own. And lastly, before we open to any questions that there might be out there, I've got here a picture of a manuscript, which is a Japanese national treasure. It was copied sometime in Japan around the date 1185 AD. Okay, but you might be able to see that each of those characters has drawn beneath it a lotus throne. If Buddhas sit upon lotus thrones and the sutra is identical to the Buddhas, then each of those characters are quite literally Buddhas, transmitters of the Dharma themselves. And the person who hand drew these lotus thrones beneath each character also made a prostration after writing each character, as he would to any Buddha he would greet. Okay? And although it's not easy for all of you to see, I have here another manuscript, which is another national treasure, a handwritten facsimile. I have a facsimile of the original here, which was written by a Tang Dynasty scribe in a city then known as Chang'an, the modern Chinese city of Xi'an, in the year 694. And it was gifted to the Japanese emperor, and it has remained in the Japanese National Archives since then. Okay, just one last little curioso about this. The reason this is such a beautiful and amazing handwritten document to read is sutras traditionally are written on scrolls in East Asia. And the funny thing about scrolls is that you have the parts of the text that are inside, buried deep in the roll, and those bits that are on the outside. And so we usually lose the outside parts of scrolls. We don't always have the entirety of texts when we have these manuscripts. But this particular scribe wanted the entire sutra, each character as a Buddha, and the sutra as an aggregate, the whole thing as a Buddha, that he could enshrine. And so he wrote the entire thing on a single scroll in minute characters. He had to be a very skilled calligrapher. And so this is an incredibly early handwritten copy of the entire text in question. This is the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, which we've been discussing. Okay. Now, the reason I show you this picture and this introduce this manuscript here as a second example is not to sort of bewilder you with the beauty and the magnificence of some of these copies of sutras. But on the one hand, I want to show you the way in which genuinely seeing the sutra as identical to the Dharma, as identical to the Buddha, and treating this mundane act of copying words from one piece of paper to another, when this is treated in the way that we've been discussing, in this, if you like, profound, this sublime, this hard to understand fashion, it produces these magnificent documents, these beautiful dharmic witnesses to the transmission of Dharma across time. And the last thing I show you these examples, the last reason I show these examples is because when you copy out your sutras, and tantras, you might have a small notebook. You might not be a particularly skilled artist. You might not be able to do these beautiful lotus thrones. Yours might be a much more humble document. But like the scribes who copied these two documents, you have absolutely no idea where your copied sutra will end up one day. Neither of these scribes could possibly imagine that I could be sitting here in a country they could not have known about, not in person with all of you, on technology that is as close to magic as they could imagine, discussing and showing their copied sutras. You have no idea where your manuscripts will go, however humble they may be. So in closing there, before I open for any questions that folks might have, I'd like to say I appreciate the problems we had with the slides. I appreciate that some of the things here are quite dense and maybe difficult to understand. I appreciate you sticking with me. Please copy sutras. Take these practices in earnest. Don't shy away from the profound, heady discussion that we talked about in the first half of our talk. Chew. You might not be able to view sutras that way tangibly now, but you can imagine what it would be like if that were the case, and therefore enact this mundane activity of copying from what it would be like if that were the case, until you slowly cultivate yourself in such a way that you develop a sense of that strange, non-intuitive way of viewing these mundane dharmic activities that we saw in the sutra there. And then, at that point, when you see the sutra you copy, you see the Buddha. The entirety of your anuttara samyak sambuddhi is there. And just like we did here, you can use mundane practices like copying as the frame for the entirety of your practice. Pick one. Copy sutras. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you sticking with me. Thank you. Okay. All right. I can see a hand there by Amy, and I can see Simran as well. Amy, if you'd like to ask your question.
Oh, thank you, Reverend. That was an incredibly inspiring talk, and it just is like the icing on the cake for me, because I asked my Theravada monk recently that when I sometimes read the sutras, that I find my mind a bit, the language is flowery, so my mind might just kind of wander off a bit. And he recommended that I pick sutras that speak to me and write them out. So I had this big inspiration to go out, and I bought a really cute little notebook, and I wanted to, and I thought I'm going to learn calligraphy. So I've got a calligraphy book, and I haven't actually written a sutra out yet, but I've got everything in place too. So this is just really the reverence that you've taught me tonight is just perfect timing. So I really thank you for your guidance, and I'll be taking what you said, and just really, yeah, it just adds so much beauty to what I was planning to do. And I wanted to ask you, is it like, because obviously everything's online, I don't have sūtra books or scrolls to copy. Is it okay just to get them offline and print it on paper and then copy that out on paper, from paper
Absolutely.
to paper?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. One useful way of thinking about that issue, because it's one that comes up surprisingly often. A lot of people are now reading, for example, sutras, tantras digitally. And there's a strange relationship that we feel towards these digital texts, right? They don't feel quite as reverential. We feel, in some sense, like, they might be on our phone, on our computer. Maybe we do other things on our phone and computer that are not as reverential as reading suttas and so forth, right? It brings in all of these other sorts of questions. The short answer is absolutely, it is fine to do those things, but use it as the framework in the way that we talked about here for the entirety of the 3 trainings, etc. So in other words, when you are looking at the text digitally and you have that reflection, this is not quite as good as a beautiful manuscript of the, the Dirghāgama or the Samyutta Nikaya, or whatever it might be. When you have that thought, no, every single word spoken, written, cognized, remembered, transmitted is a Buddha. It is the whole of the Dharma. It may be in a more reverential form or a less reverential form in which you find it. But the point here is, as long as you have the lens, I'm wearing glasses, as long as you have the lens that is capable of doing that reflective act, absolutely, make every chance of doing so. And just as a really silly example, my teacher that Johnny mentioned in the quick introduction, he mentioned my late teacher, Ara Ryokan was his name. He's no longer, he has shuffled off that particular coil, let's say. But one of the things that he would say to me, so when I learnt sutras from him, when I ordained and I learnt sutras from him, that process entailed him reciting the text from memory, from start to finish. And if he did it incorrectly, he would say, no, we've got to do it again. Once he had done it correctly, he would then have me look at the written text and try to do it correctly. And he would stop me at each point where I said it incorrectly, or I missed a word, or I jumped a line, etc., etc. We would start again until we got that process right. And one day I was struggling. A big part of monastic training is memorizing these texts, right? Memorizing. And we can talk about that a bit if people are interested in why that's important. But one day I was really struggling to memorize a particular chapter of a work which is just full of dharanis. Dharanis are like long mantras. And therefore you've got pages and pages that almost are, they're not intelligible sentences. I can understand, the Sanskrit, but they're not intelligible sentences. It's very hard to memorize those kinds of things. I was really struggling. And I turned to my teacher at the end of a day of trying to do this when he asked me how I was going. And I said, you do it flawlessly. And I'm sure that your teacher did it flawlessly. And, I'm so lucky to have a vessel like you, someone who is able to do this and pass it on and in such a way. And I one day maybe I will be in that place. Maybe I will be such a reverential transmitter of the Dharma, unblemished in my recitation and ability to transmit to someone else. And he very curtly stopped me and said, no, you've completely misunderstood. I am an impure vessel, just as you are. Yeah. But that which I'm transmitting is the Dharma, is the pure thing. Yeah. So much like a digital text might not feel as beautiful as this handwritten manuscript here, it might not feel as reverential. It might be an imperfect vessel, just like my imperfect teacher. But once I have embodied that thing, that Dharma, that's the purity that is then lent to the entire process. That digital text is now made pure by the relation, the dialogue with that process that you inculcated. So treat not just the written books that you come across, nice, perfect, complete versus imperfect, dirty, incomplete, and the same with your human vessels. There are good Dharma teachers and mediocre Dharma teachers, and we've all met ones that we worry about, right? We've all experienced the spectrum of things. But what is at the heart of this practice, these textual practices, copying, reading, reciting, memorizing, all of them, is this sense that the Dharma is truth. It is this thing with value. And when we engage with that, when our entire being is invested in that, our thought, our body, in the act of writing, our speech, even in the act of not speaking, I don't want to spit on the sutra, right? As we saw, we become identical to the Dharma. We embody it, literally, we're embodying it. That dialogue is what makes purity, not each of those components being perfect, wonderful, pristine. I hope that didn't go too far from what you're asking, but just as to keep that breadth there for those doing similar other practices. I think Simran, I saw your hand.
Yes, thank you, Reverend. Interestingly, I also did a seminary program in a Mahayana temple in Indonesia, and these what's on screen here were all down the walls, and we were just meditating most of the day, walking, sitting for an hour, alternating. And as we'd walk, because that's all we could do, I'd just be seeing those, and I didn't understand what it was. But interestingly, that that's carrying some form of dharma. It's got some meaning behind it. It's interesting in that way. That was just a reflection. My question is regarding much earlier on in the guided practice we had, right towards the end of that script, there was something there about letting the truth and the untruth manifest, or something in that sense. So I just wanted to ask you what that meant.
Good question. So the script that we use for the visualization is doing something that it's attempting to be an appropriate reflective process for someone at the beginning stages, but also someone at a very high level of practice as well. Now, the reason I mention that is because what you might have noticed as we went forward is the initial reflection was on the very provisional sense objects that we were engaging with, the sutra scrolls itself, the characters, the pen, and the ability of that to have a relationship to the ultimate and the unbounded, right? The second part of the visualization was where we asked all of those penetrating questions. Who is the copier? Is there a self that is copying? If there's no self that is copying, then the fourfold assembly that we imagined receiving this copy that we've made is also selfless and therefore not there. We asked all of these penetrating, if you like, cutting questions. The first one was understanding the provisional nature of the Dharma. The second one, with all of those penetrating questions, was understanding the shunyata, the shunya, the emptiness side of the Dharma, as opposed to those provisional qualities. And then the part that you were asking about specifically was that last part, wherein we talked about the fact that the Dharma is exceptionally sublime and rare. And I now see, hear, and attain the black and white of the letters and pages. And due to the arrangement of the colored grains and the patterns in the liquid of the ink, it is such that truth and untruth are both made manifest, I think was the wording. That last part was actually bringing together the provisional and the empty side. The provisional side is what we don't think of as the provisional there necessarily. Oh, no, let's keep it simple. The provisional side was the black and white of the letters and pages, the ink, the colored grains. Somehow these abstract items make patterns on a page that are intelligible, that are transmitters of the dharmas. There is something sublime to that. Yeah, it is difficult to understand. But all of those things were provisional, mundane, tangible. And then that last part, it is such that truth and untruth are both made manifest. The Dharma is not ink, grains of ink, swirls on a page, right? It is not those provisional things. And yet, the marrying of the provisional objects on the one hand and the unlimited, unsurpassed, exceptionally sublime Dharma on the other came together in the, if you like, mystery in the sense of it is hard for us to fathom. The mystery that somehow all of these mundane, limited, let's use loaded language, pathetic, unclean items are the very means by which the truth, the Dharma, and untruth, in this case, untruth is those things which one ought not to do, are somehow both made manifest. So we had the coming together of the three, the first, the provisional, the second, the empty, and then we brought them together in that last part. So I included that because I think it's still useful for those who are not able to follow all three stages necessarily on the one hand, but for those who are as well and are keen to see that, because you'll notice, remember, what we talked about was this marrying. The sutra is a limited object, and yet it is the holder of Dharma. A single instance of Dharma, this particular sutra, is limited, and yet the entirety of the Dharma, unlimited, is included herein. I am limited, and yet by embodying the Dharma, I am also unlimited. And so forth and so forth. This is the relationship. The marrying of those two is the practice of copy, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if there are any other questions. I can't see.
No, there weren't any in the chat, Reverend. Due to time, we might just need to wrap up the talk then. Thank you so much for that. Absolutely fantastic.
Thank you for bearing with me.
I feel completely inspired to begin this practice. Feels like it'll be a really good addition. Reverend, would I be able to pass over to you to do a brief dedication of merits for our talk this evening?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No problem at all. 요진님미묘호 혁세만고난송읍 가공견몬 독근입 강예뇨라이 신이증이 간니시 그도급 응유의 사잉아토요슈조 I dedicate the merit of this Dharma talk and any copying of sutra texts from here on to all sentient beings, that I and they may together accomplish Anuttara Samyak Sambuddhi. Many thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Reverend, and thank you everyone for attending this evening. It was wonderful to have you all here. I know I learned a lot from this session, so thank you all very much. Thank you again, Reverend, and wishing you all a safe and happy rest of your week. Good night, everyone.